So, for as long as we can remember, Vladimir Putin has treated Europe as background noise, a divided continent, economically perhaps useful, although stagnant, politically timid, and strategically irrelevant. But something, especially in most recent days, is changing, a symbolism of a mindset shift in Moscow. Over the past days, Putin hasn't just reorientated to Ukraine and Washington, but specifically targeting Europe, mocking its leaders, accusing them of theft, warning of retaliation, and questioning the legitimacy or sustainability of the Eurozone project. And that shift matters because leaders don't suddenly elevate a target unless it becomes a problem. And for Europe, for the first time in a long while, it is starting to interfere with Putin's interests in ways that he has to pay attention to. And considering that we have now seen the rejection of the potential of accessing and utilizing the frozen assets, the Europeans have now given a 90 billion euro aid package alone, which, while useful to Ukraine, is still significant for what it does and means for Europe's perspective and durability and the longer term scale of the conflict. All that in mind, I wanted to make this video to understand what it means going forward in the next, or perhaps even days, weeks, and how Europe can really elevate and perhaps risk, though, its personal longevity. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you're new here, we look at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, economic statecraft. Not just what is happening, but why it is and what it means, breaking down the headlines. A lot of news coming out of Europe in the past days. I made a video just yesterday in the same crinkled iron shirt, which I'm sure some of you viewers will absolutely love. But given the severity of what we saw in the past 24 hours, the rejection of the usage of the frozen assets, the 210 billion euros, mainly because of Belgium, and now a 90 billion euro loan. That is something that I think is worth another quick analysis, another quick reaction. Now, before continuing, and as usual, I ask you guys, what do you make of this most recent development? Does it make a difference? Is it perhaps a risk, given it is a long-standing loan and the European taxpayers forking the bill for something which, well, perhaps the preference would be for the Kremlin to do so? Let me know in the comments below. Now, if you're not aware of what Europe just did, well, after more than 16 hours of negotiations, the EU agreed on this 90 billion loan to Ukraine. It will be raised on capital markets backed by the EU's shared budget and designed to fund Ukraine for over 2 years. It's a critical lifeline, giving Kyiv's warning that it faces this financial collapse potentially in as early as the first quarter of next year. And crucially, Ukraine will only repay the loan if Russia repays reparations. And if Moscow doesn't, which, well, I cannot see how it's going to be forced to do so, the Russian assets remain immobilized. In other words, Europe didn't seize Russian money outright, but it has locked it away indefinitely and built a financial structure that assumes Russia, not Ukraine, is ultimately responsible. Oh, the timing is very good. The European Council head, Antonio Costa, summed it up bluntly that we are committed, we are delivering. For Ukraine, this is enormous. The loan covers roughly 2/3 of its budgetary and military needs for over the next 2 years and strengthens Kyiv's hand in the ongoing US-led negotiations. But for Europe, the significance goes far beyond the headline number, partially because of what it means for their financial capabilities and willingness to stand up to not just Moscow, but Washington, but also from a negative standpoint. Europe has a lot of issues it has to deal with outside of Ukraine, and there is a lot of debate, including within myself, about whether or not this is the best use of European funds, whether it is the best thing within the interest of Europe. Indeed, on the flip side, what Europe didn't do is just as revealing. For months, as we've discussed, they have been debating to use these Russian sovereign assets, most of them in Belgium, to fund Ukraine directly. Now, that plan is disintegrated. Belgium is home to Euroclear, which has demanded sweeping guarantees against any legal challenges and Russian retaliation. Other governments have bowled, the obvious ones, Hungary, Slovakia, but interestingly, the Czech Republic have also refused to support using EU cash at all. And so the result was this compromise. Ukraine gets some form of money. European taxpayers are now on the hook even more, but not Russia. And from a narrow, practical perspective, it does still work. Some officials in Brussels have put it that this is not about getting Kyiv the money. It's about how. But strategically, it exposes something bigger. When confronted with the threats from Putin, legal intimidation and financial pressure that aside, Europe blinks and in some ways buckles. It's not really what I want to see. I am very, as they say, on the fence about leveraging Russian assets at all. But the fact that Europe doesn't have a more coherent and coordinated, unified approach to dispelling the threats or risks posed by not just Moscow, but Washington or any outsider actor, including Beijing, it demonstrates that Europe really needs to get its act together if it wants to be considered a strategical player on the same level as any of those other three bigger powers. Unsurprisingly, Vladimir Putin's reaction was immediate, but interestingly focused. He has accused European leaders of stealing Russia's money, warned that immobilizing the assets would undermine confidence in the whole Eurozone, and claimed that oil-producing countries are already reconsidering holding reserves in euros. And he's floated a broader warning if that sovereign assets can be frozen over Ukraine. What stops the West from targeting any country, be them Islamic or such, over social or political disputes? And so this isn't a rhetoric. It is a threat aimed directly at not just Europe's ideological or social heart, but at its financial credibility. One of the biggest comparative advantages Europe has. And it tells us something important, that he is lashing out not because Europe is weak, but because Europe is finally touching the areas that it does worry Putin. And for years, something that Moscow assumed Europe would argue endlessly or defer to Washington and eventually prioritize stability over confrontation. This time, Europe hasn't done that, but this lack of commitment also means it gives an opening for Moscow to leverage to its own interests and circumstances. That all aside, this is where the picture gets even more complicated. On the one hand, Europe has strengthened Ukraine's position dramatically. It's funding for 2 years, it removes any short-term financial blackmail, and it keeps Russia's assets locked, as I've said. It's more a comment. It's certainly a key lever against Washington. But on the other hand, Europe has once again shown how difficult it is to outright endure or establish how to confront these risks. Western governments have hesitated throughout this war, be it on advanced weapons, on strikes inside or across Russia, or enforcing sanctions fully, all out of fear of this escalation. The asset debate fits the same pattern. Europe, of course, wants to help, but it fears setting precedents. It fears the retaliation, and it fears internal division more than it fears Moscow. And as some have put it, the optics are very grim. Europe has emerged defiant, but it's bruised in that defiance. And one again questions, what is the real point of the European Union if it's not going to approach things collectively? But here's the part that often gets misunderstood, especially outside of Europe. How a bad deal is worse than no deal. Sounds a bit like Brexit. Europe's support for Ukraine isn't just moral or legal. It is in some ways existential. European leaders talk about defending democracy, sovereignty, and international law. And they do mean it. But there is a harder, colder calculation underneath all of this. A peace deal that favors Putin in any way is not stability. The eyes of some, perhaps more of the hawkish countries in Europe, it's a countdown. From certain countries' perspectives in Europe, a weak settlement would leave Moscow larger, more confident, and vastly better prepared for any potential future confrontation. Russia would emerge with expanded territory, validated methods, and a war economy already mobilized, capable of sustaining high military production for years, regardless of the costs on the Russian people. That's not a peace, that's a prelude. And European capitals, especially again in the east, along, say, the Baltics, the Polish, or the Romanians, see what follows. They would be forced into a frantic rearmament cycle, massively increasing defense spending just to restore this deterrence, while Russia tests NATO's resolve along longer and more dangerous frontiers. In any such scenario, Europe doesn't buy security, it buys time, which is why for Europe a bad deal is arguably worse than no deal at all. And this is where Europe and Washington are diverging, not tactically at the lower levels, but strategically. The Trump administration, as we know, wants a quick settlement. Its language is about strategic stability with Russia, reducing escalation risks, reopening economic channels, and moving on. Indeed, Trump sees the world very similar to Vladimir Putin. Now, Europe, of course, sees something different, but as we've seen in the national security strategy published just last week, Europe is the problem. Increasingly, Europe has become a symbolism of the remnants of liberal democracy, rule of law, a lot of the principles and values that the West, at least, established after the Second World War, but Trump seems to have an inherent dislike to. The infamous J.D. Vance speech at Munich Security Conference in February, rejecting a lot of sort of the socialist or communistic emergencies within Europe, which is, of course, absolutely absurd. But the point is that Europe is very different to what Trump or much of his MAGA community see the world and would prefer. And that Russia, Putin's Russia, is a better version, and that a Russia, which, to be honest, I can imagine a world where, I'd love to imagine a world where Russia was part of a constructive player, a lot closer to the West, but doesn't exist with Putin in power. But he seems to think, Trump nonetheless, that Russia is better off as a strategical ally than Europe. And European leaders in Ukraine see Russia as that long-term issue that must be deterred, not accommodated. Trust in this view isn't given. It is earned, it's verified and enforced. And various senior officials, including German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, has put it bluntly that if we cannot achieve the lasting just peace for not just Ukraine but ourselves, we will not have any guarantee for long-term continental security. It's therefore not about idealism, about self-preservation, but clearly not existential enough that they can actually reach a consensus. So this is why territory has become the central stumbling block in the peace talks. Early US proposals involved the Ukraine ceding heavily fortified areas, the backbone of obviously its defensive belt. Now, this is a strategic disaster for Europe, and even though Ukraine has pushed back, it's still exposed. Mark Rutte has sketched the nightmare scenario during a recent statement set in Berlin, that Ukraine under any form of Russian occupation or Russian forces up against the longer NATO border and this highly permanent sense of direct confrontation, well, in that world, NATO would have to surge forces eastward, absorb the huge financial costs and live with the constant escalation pressure. Now, is that something that Europe really wants to bear? Depends who you ask. Go to Spain or parts of southern Western Europe, and the imminent danger is very different to Eastern Europe, which is why it's so difficult to find a coherent strategy. Europe's fear isn't hypothetical. The idea of hybrid war, the cyber attacks, sabotage, the political interference, economic coercion happen, and they are increasing at a greater magnitude and frequency. A survey of 500 European security specialists have ranked Russia and a favorable ceasefire as one of the two biggest risks facing Europe next year. The other is grey zone conflicts. A settlement that rewards aggression wouldn't end that pressure. It would merely legitimize it. As we know in military analysis and warfare, ceasefires, even if it's very temporary, often benefit the aggressive side or the aggressor. And it would signal something even more damaging, that Europe cannot shape its own security environment. That signal would be heard far beyond Moscow. So this is why the frozen assets debate matters so much, not purely for the assets themselves, but because of what they represent, a foundation of the pathway by which Europe can choose to take. Whether it continues to pursue such choices, risky but perhaps strategically significant, or cower out at the last moment for fear of escalation, even though that is already happening. Deploying such assets is an investment in Europe's own security, whether the guns fall silent or not. If peace holds, the money helps rebuild. If Moscow rejects peace and grinds on, the money underwrites Ukraine's self-defense. Either way, it denies Moscow, in theory, an assumption it has relied on for decades, that Europe will always choose comfort over confrontation. Europe still lacks a clear doctrine, decades after it became overly complacent and reliant on the United States security apparatus. What is it doing here? Is it going to support Ukraine for Ukraine's sake all the way out? Is it to secure victory, to weaken Russia, to remove Vladimir Putin, or to manage the conflicts until some form of greater fatigue? There's no shared answer here. Every major decision becomes a new perma-crisis. Well, 90 billion in European terms is not that big, considering it has the same economic collective size as the United States. The problem, as always, is the social political element. And Putin knows that. That's why he bets on the fatigue, the division, the fear, not the battlefield dominance. This is exactly what Moscow hopes for, that war weariness combined with hybrid pressure fractures Europe's unity permanently. And if you combine that with the subtle desire of the Trump administration's goal to focus on 4 specific nations as an initial step to build greater division within Europe, it is a problem. So where does this leave us? Europe has taken one step forward, but it's not a leap. It has inserted itself just enough to rattle Moscow, but not enough to fully close off or be a deterrent towards Moscow. And so Putin is suddenly so fixated on Europe, not because the continent is weak, but because of this newfound unpredictability. And in geopolitics, uncertainty cuts both ways. Certainly, Putin likes to be unpredictable with how he may interfere or undertake certain operations elsewhere. Not, though, when it comes to his opponents, especially Europe. So the question now isn't whether Europe can help Ukraine, but help itself, whether it's prepared to accept the costs, political, financial, strategic, of actually shaping the outcome of this war, but also its in future. Because if it doesn't, well, Putin will keep testing the limits and betting that fear eventually does the rest. But that's it from me, everyone. Let me know in the comments below what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this. I try my best to bring a cautious optimism, but also a degree of pragmatism Europe has a lot to figure out, and I hope that 26 can be a better case of what it should do, as well as what it can do. Look forward to seeing you all in the next one. Take care.